The soil beneath Eleanor Hayes' fingernails was the familiar kind, rich and dark, smelling of promise and patience. At 52, she had spent more mornings than she could count tending her garden, coaxing reluctant seeds into vibrant life in the backyard of her brick colonial in Laurelwood. The spring air held that perfect balance of warmth and crispness that made her feel alive, awakened after the long Pennsylvania winter. "Mom, have you seen my blue folder? The one with all the wedding venue information." Melissa's voice carried from the kitchen window, cutting through Eleanor's peaceful reverie. "Check the dining room table," Eleanor called back, patting the soil around a newly planted rosebush. "I think I saw it there last night after dinner." Eleanor smiled, thinking of her 28-year-old daughter's mounting excitement. The wedding was still 6 months away, but Melissa approached it with the same methodical planning she brought to her work as an architectural engineer. Spreadsheets, timelines, contingency plans. Eleanor sometimes wondered if her daughter was building a bridge, rather than planning a celebration of love. David, Eleanor's husband of 30 years, teased that Melissa had inherited her mother's organizational tendencies, but Eleanor knew better. Her own approach to life had always been more organic, like her gardening, attentive to what each day brought, responsive rather than directive. It was David who color-coded their tax files and maintained the household budget with precision. As if summoned by her thoughts, David appeared at the garden gate, dressed for work in his charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. "I'm heading out," he said, his voice holding the same warm timbre that had first drawn her to him at a mutual friend's graduation party all those years ago. "Conference call at 9, then meetings until lunch." Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Will you be home for dinner? I was thinking of making that lemon chicken you like." David smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way that still made her heart flutter slightly. "Wouldn't miss it. Mind if I invite Richard to join us? He's in town for that sustainability conference." Eleanor nodded. Richard had been David's best friend since college, and though his visits were infrequent due to his work as an environmental consultant that took him around the world, he was always a welcome guest, practically family after all these years. "Of course. Tell him 6:30. David crossed the garden, careful to stay on the stone path Eleanor had laid herself the previous summer, and kissed her lightly on the cheek. "You know, you're even more beautiful now than when I met you," he said quietly, his eyes soft. Eleanor flushed, turning her face slightly to catch his lips with hers in a brief, tender kiss. 3 decades together, and he could still make her feel like the 22-year-old college graduate who had fallen head over heels for the thoughtful young man who quoted Mary Oliver poetry and remembered how she took her coffee. "Flattery will get you everywhere," she murmured, breathing in his familiar scent of sandalwood cologne and mint toothpaste. "Now go before you're late." She watched him walk across the lawn to his car, his stride confident and purposeful, the morning sun catching the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair. Their life together had been built on thousands of such ordinary moments. Brief kisses, shared meals, quiet conversations as they fell asleep facing each other in their queen-sized bed. There had been difficulties, of course. What marriage didn't weather challenges? But nothing they hadn't faced together, their partnership stronger for having been tested. Eleanor returned to her gardening, relishing the simple pleasure of working with her hands, watching birds dart among the oak branches above her. This garden had been her sanctuary through every phase of their family life. The sleep-deprived years of new parenthood, the bustling chaos of Melissa's teenage activities, the adjustment to an empty nest when she left for college. Now, with Melissa temporarily moved back home while she saved for a house with her fiancé James, the family dynamic had shifted yet again, finding a new equilibrium. "Found it," Melissa called triumphantly from the kitchen. Moments later she appeared in the garden, blue folder tucked under her arm, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She had David's height and Eleanor's curves, her dark hair cut in a practical bob that swung as she walked. "I brought you some tea." "My hero," Eleanor said, accepting the mug gratefully. "Earl Grey. With a splash of milk, just how you like it," Melissa confirmed, settling onto the wooden bench beside the herb garden. She was dressed for her job at the architectural firm downtown. A charcoal pencil skirt and crisp white blouse, sensible heels. "I have that client presentation at 11, but I'm free for lunch if you want to meet up. I know you have that doctor's appointment nearby." Eleanor nodded, taking a sip of the perfectly prepared tea. That sounds lovely. Nothing serious, just my annual checkup. She smiled reassuringly at her daughter, who had inherited David's tendency to worry. The joys of middle age, more frequent medical appointments. Melissa laughed, the sound reminiscent of the carefree girl she had been before the responsibilities of adulthood settled onto her shoulders. You're hardly decrepit, Mom. You've got more energy than half my colleagues. Flattery must run in the family today, Eleanor said with a wink. Your father was similarly complimentary before he left. Gross, Melissa said with mock disgust, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. You two are still embarrassingly in love. One of life's greatest blessings, Eleanor said simply. Speaking of which, how's James? Still surviving those overnight shifts at the hospital? Melissa's expression softened at the mention of her fiancé, a third-year resident in emergency medicine. Exhausted but good. He has a 48-hour break starting tomorrow, so we're going to look at those houses in Oakmont again. The colonial with the big backyard is still available. The one with the maple trees? It would be perfect for you, Eleanor said, genuinely pleased. The thought of her daughter and soon-to-be son-in-law settling just 20 minutes away filled her with quiet joy. Good schools in that district too, for whenever you decide to think about that next chapter. One milestone at a time, Mom, Melissa said, though without irritation. It was a conversation they'd had many times. Eleanor eager for grandchildren, Melissa determined to establish her career first. Wedding then house, then we'll see. Eleanor nodded, respecting her daughter's boundaries. Of course. No pressure, just anticipation. They chatted comfortably for another few minutes before Melissa glanced at her watch and stood. I should get going. Traffic's been terrible with that construction on Westbrook Avenue. Tell me about it, Eleanor said, rising to walk her daughter to the gate. I'll meet you at that cafe across from your office, Lavender and Lace? Noon. Perfect, Melissa said, giving her mother a quick hug. Love you, Mom. Love you more, Eleanor replied automatically, their long-time parting ritual. After Melissa left, Eleanor returned to her gardening, losing herself in the rhythm of the work, her mind pleasantly drifting. This was her favorite kind of morning, unhurried, productive, filled with small interactions with the people she loved most. She knew herself fortunate to have such a life, built stone by stone over the years. A solid marriage, a daughter blossoming into her own adulthood, work that fulfilled her as an elementary school librarian, a home that truly felt like a haven. At 10:30, she reluctantly put away her gardening tools, showered, and changed into a floral blouse and comfortable slacks for her doctor's appointment. The day was warming nicely as she backed her Subaru out of the driveway, the car radio playing a Van Morrison song that reminded her of road trips they'd taken when Melissa was young, the three of them singing along, windows down, heading toward the mountains or the shore. Dr. Ramsey's office was housed in a modern medical building downtown, all glass and steel, a stark contrast to the Victorian homes that lined the residential streets of Laurelwood. Eleanor had been seeing Dr. Ramsey for nearly 15 years now, appreciating the woman's straightforward manner and genuine care. The waiting room was mercifully uncrowded, and Eleanor had barely settled with her book, the latest and Patchett novel, when a nurse called her name. The routine was familiar: weight, blood pressure, temperature, a few standard questions about medications and any new symptoms. Eleanor answered honestly that she'd been feeling well, perhaps a bit more tired than usual, but she attributed that to the busy spring schedule at the library, with reading programs and author visits filling her calendar. Dr. Ramsey entered with her typical brisk energy, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed Eleanor's chart. Eleanor, good to see you, she said warmly, setting aside the tablet and focusing her attention fully on her patient. How have you been feeling since I saw you last? Generally well, Eleanor replied. Maybe a bit more fatigued than usual, but nothing concerning. The doctor nodded, making a note. Any changes in appetite? Weight fluctuations? Eleanor considered. I've lost a few pounds without trying, but I've been more active in the garden now that spring is here. The appointment proceeded with the usual thoroughness, a physical examination, discussions about preventative care appropriate for Eleanor's age, orders for routine blood work. It wasn't until the end that Dr. Ramsey's expression shifted slightly, a subtle change that sent an inexplicable chill through Eleanor. I did want to follow up on that mammogram from last month, Dr. Ramsey said, her voice still professional but with a new gentleness that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. There was an area of concern that the radiologist flagged. Eleanor felt a curious detachment, as if she were suddenly floating slightly above herself, observing the scene from a distance. What kind of concern? She heard herself ask, her voice steady. A small mass in your left breast that wasn't present in your previous scans, Dr. Ramsey explained. It could be entirely benign, many such findings are, but I'd like to schedule a biopsy to be certain. Eleanor nodded, her mind racing ahead even as she maintained a calm exterior. She had always prided herself on being practical in the face of challenges. Of course. How soon? I can have my staff check for openings this week, Dr. Ramsey said, her eyes kind behind her professional demeanor. Try not to worry too much before we have more information, Eleanor. Many women go through this additional testing with benign results. I understand, Eleanor said, though a part of her knew instinctively that this was not merely a false alarm. Something in Dr. Ramsey's careful tone, perhaps, or a premonition she couldn't quite name. The rest of the appointment passed in a blur of scheduling and paperwork. Eleanor found herself walking back to her car in the bright sunshine, the world around her unchanged yet somehow altered. For a moment, she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she took one deep breath, then another. Don't borrow trouble, she murmured to herself, one of her mother's favorite sayings. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and grace she brought to every challenge in her life. And she wouldn't say anything to David or Melissa yet, not until there was something definitive to tell. Eleanor glanced at her watch and realized she was already 10 minutes late for lunch with Melissa. She started the car and pulled out of the parking space, pushing her worries aside for now. One step at a time, just as she'd always approached life. The cafe was bustling with the lunch crowd when Eleanor arrived, but she spotted Melissa immediately, sitting at a corner table by the window, focused on her phone. Eleanor took a moment to simply observe her daughter, the serious set of her features as she concentrated, the unconscious habit of tucking her hair behind her ear, the confident posture that Eleanor had always admired. Love welled up in her chest, so intense it was almost painful. Sorry I'm late, Eleanor said as she approached the table. The appointment ran longer than expected. Melissa looked up, her expression brightening. No problem. I was just answering some work emails. Everything okay at the doctor's? Eleanor slid into the chair across from her daughter, reaching for the menu though she already knew what she wanted. Just the usual prodding and poking, she said lightly. How did your presentation go? Really well, Melissa said, her enthusiasm evident. They loved the sustainable elements we incorporated, especially the green roof design. The firm might even get a write-up in Architectural Digest if the project goes forward. That's wonderful, Eleanor said sincerely, grateful for the shift in focus. Your grandfather would have been so proud, his granddaughter carrying on the family interest in building, even if you chose a different path than construction. Melissa smiled at the mention of her grandfather, Eleanor's father, who had passed away 5 years earlier. I was thinking about him this morning, actually. Remember how he used to say buildings were just stories told in brick and wood? He had a poet's soul trapped in a contractor's body, Eleanor agreed, the memory bittersweet. Her father had been her first teacher in understanding how to nurture growth, though his medium had been structures rather than gardens. He would have had so many opinions about your wedding plans. All of them unsolicited, Melissa laughed. But speaking of the wedding, James and I were thinking. Whatever Melissa had been about to say was interrupted by the arrival of their server, a young woman with a sleeve of colorful tattoos and a warm smile. They ordered a Cobb salad for Melissa, tomato soup and half a sandwich for Eleanor, whose appetite had diminished since leaving the doctor's office. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally between wedding plans, work anecdotes, and local gossip. Eleanor found herself studying her daughter's face with new intensity, memorizing the animation in her expressions, the passion with which she spoke about her projects, the way her eyes, so like David's, crinkled when she laughed. Mom! Melissa's voice broke through Eleanor's reverie. You seem distracted. Are you sure everything's okay? Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. Just thinking about how proud I am of the woman you've become, she said truthfully, if not completely. Sometimes it hits me all at once. Melissa's expression softened. Getting sentimental in your old age, she teased gently. It's my prerogative as your mother, Eleanor responded with a smile. Embarrassing you with emotions is in the parental job description. The rest of lunch passed pleasantly, and when they parted with a hug on the sidewalk outside, Eleanor held on perhaps a moment longer than usual, breathing in the scent of her daughter's perfume, feeling the solidness of her in her arms. See you at home later, Melissa said. Don't forget, Dad invited Richard for dinner. 6:30, Eleanor confirmed. I'll stop at the market on the way home for fresh lemons. As she drove to the grocery store, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to the doctor's appointment, the careful neutrality in Dr. Ramsey's voice as she mentioned the biopsy. Eleanor had always considered herself a realist, not pessimistic, but clear-eyed about life's uncertainties. Now she found herself calculating her age, remembering her mother's health history, heart disease, not cancer, wondering about the statistics Dr. Ramsey had mentioned about false positives. The biopsy was scheduled for Thursday, just 2 days away. Eleanor decided she would wait until after that, until there was something concrete to share, before talking to David or Melissa. No sense in alarming them prematurely. Besides, there was Richard's visit to prepare for, Melissa's ongoing wedding plans to discuss, the spring book fair at the elementary school to organize. Life continued regardless of what might be growing inside her. At the grocery store, Eleanor selected lemons with particular care, testing each one for firmness and scent. She added asparagus and small red potatoes to her basket, then on impulse a pint of premium ice cream, David's favorite butter pecan. If these days were to be shadowed by uncertainty, she would ensure they were also filled with small pleasures. By the time she arrived home, Eleanor had regained her equilibrium. She unloaded the groceries, preheated the oven, and began preparations for dinner, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of cooking. She had just put the chicken in to roast when she heard the front door open, followed by David's voice calling her name. In the kitchen, she called back, washing her hands at the sink. David appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket slung over his arm. Something smells amazing already, he said appreciatively. Eleanor turned to face him, drying her hands on a dish towel. Just getting started. How was your day? Productive, he replied, crossing the kitchen to kiss her. The Thompson project is finally moving forward after months of delays. How about yours? How was the doctor's appointment? For a brief moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything. The mammogram results, the scheduled biopsy, the fear that had settled like a small stone in the pit of her stomach. But looking at his face, relaxed and happy after a successful workday, she couldn't bring herself to cast a shadow over their evening. Routine, she said instead, turning back to the counter to slice lemons. Dr. Ramsey says I'm in excellent health for a woman my age. David laughed, opening the refrigerator to pour himself a glass of water. As if there was any doubt. You have more vitality than people half your age. Eleanor smiled, accepting the compliment without comment. Richard confirmed he's coming? Yes, around 6. He's looking forward to seeing you and Melissa. Said it's been too long since he's had a home-cooked meal. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of long partnership, David setting the dining room table while Eleanor continued with dinner preparations. When Melissa arrived home an hour later, she joined in, preparing a salad while sharing stories from her workday. The normalcy of it all, this domestic choreography they had perfected over years, felt suddenly precious to Eleanor, worth protecting for as long as possible. Richard arrived exactly on time, bearing a bottle of good red wine and a small potted orchid for Eleanor. Now in his early 50s like David, Richard had maintained his lanky physique and easygoing manner, though his once blonde hair had receded considerably. He embraced Eleanor warmly. The house looks wonderful, Elle, he said, using the nickname that had stuck since college days. That new paint color in the living room is perfect. Still the charmer, Eleanor teased, accepting the gifts. The orchid is beautiful. Dinner was a lively affair, with Richard regaling them with stories from his recent work in Costa Rica, where he'd been consulting on a sustainable tourism development. Melissa and James's wedding plans were discussed, with Richard promising to clear his schedule for the October date. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," he said sincerely, raising his glass in a small toast to Melissa. "I still remember when your mom brought you home from the hospital. Tiniest little thing with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. Richard was the first friend to visit us in the hospital," David explained to Melissa, though she'd heard the story before. "He brought this ridiculous oversized teddy bear that was bigger than you were." "I still have that bear," Melissa said with a grin. "It's in the attic somewhere." "You should incorporate it into the wedding somehow," Richard suggested. "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and something from Uncle Richard who's been around forever." They all laughed, and Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for this moment. The people she loved most gathered around her table, sharing food and stories, connected by years of shared history. Whatever might come next, she had always had this, a life rich with love and friendship. After dinner, as David and Richard settled in the living room with glasses of scotch to continue catching up, Eleanor and Melissa cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher. "Richard hasn't changed a bit," Melissa observed, wrapping leftover chicken in foil. "Well, except for the hair situation." Eleanor chuckled. "Don't let him hear you say that. He's sensitive about the baldness." "I think it suits him," Melissa said. "Makes him look distinguished." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Melissa spoke again, her voice more tentative. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," Eleanor said, running water into the roasting pan to soak. "How did you know Dad was the right one? I mean, really know, not just hope or think." Eleanor turned off the water, considering the question seriously. "That's not as straightforward as you might think," she said finally. "There wasn't a single moment of certainty. It was more like a gradual recognition. The relationship just kept making more sense, not less, as time went on. And I liked who I was when I was with him. He brought out the best in me, challenged me in good ways." Melissa nodded slowly. "I feel that way with James. Like I'm more myself around him, not less." "That's a powerful thing," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "But I should also say, marriage isn't about being certain every day. There are times when you choose the relationship even when feelings are complicated. The vows aren't just pretty words." "You and Dad make it look easy," Melissa said, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. Eleanor laughed softly. "Because you didn't see the hard years. The year your dad was passed over for partnership at his old firm and questioned every career choice he'd ever made. The summer after my mother died, when I was so lost in grief I could barely function. We've had our struggles, believe me." "But you never seemed to doubt each other," Melissa persisted. "Not each other, no," Eleanor acknowledged. "We've always been a team, even when times were difficult. That's the foundation everything else is built on." She reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear, a maternal gesture from childhood. "Are you having doubts about James?" "No," Melissa said quickly, then more thoughtfully. "Not doubts exactly. More like recognizing the enormity of what we're promising each other. Forever is a long time." "The longest," Eleanor agreed. "But it's also made up of individual days, one after another. And most of those days are ordinary. Cooking dinner, paying bills, deciding who's going to take the car for an oil change. The sacred is in the ordinary, I've found." Melissa's expression softened. "That's beautiful, Mom. Don't tell your father I'm getting philosophical," Eleanor said with a wink. "He already thinks I spend too much time reading poetry in the garden when I should be weeding." They finished the kitchen cleanup and joined the men in the living room, where the conversation had turned to local politics. Eleanor settled beside David on the sofa, his arm automatically moving around her shoulders. She leaned into his familiar warmth, watching Melissa engage Richard in a spirited debate about the proposed development near the town's historic district. The evening stretched pleasantly on, and by the time Richard departed with promises to visit again before heading back to his home base in Colorado, Eleanor felt a deep contentment despite the uncertainty that awaited her. This was her life, these people, this home, these conversations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, these foundations would remain. Later, as she and David prepared for bed, moving through their nighttime routine with practiced efficiency, Eleanor found herself studying her husband's profile as he read in bed, reading glasses perched on his nose, the bedside lamp casting a warm glow across his features. "What?" he asked, looking up from his book with a small smile. "You're staring." "Just appreciating the view," Eleanor replied lightly, sliding beneath the covers beside him. "Is that allowed after 30 years?" David set his book aside, removing his glasses. "Encouraged even," he said, turning toward her. His expression grew more serious. "Are you really okay, Elle? You seemed a little quiet during dinner." For a moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything, laying out her fears in the darkness of their bedroom where they had shared so many confidences over the years. But the biopsy was only 2 days away. Better to wait for something concrete than to inject needless worry into their lives. "Just thinking about time," she said instead, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Watching Melissa prepare for her wedding, seeing Richard again after so long. It makes you reflective." David nodded, reaching out to trace her cheekbone with gentle fingers. "Good reflections, I hope?" "The best," she assured him, covering his hand with her own. "I was just thinking how fortunate I've been in love." Something in her tone must have betrayed her, for David's eyes searched hers with sudden intensity. "Eleanor, if something's wrong." "Nothing's wrong," she interrupted softly. "Just a moment of existential contemplation. It happens at our age." "Speak for yourself," he said, relaxing slightly. "I'm still a spring chicken." "A very distinguished spring chicken," she teased, grateful for the lighter turn in conversation. David clicked off the lamp and settled beside her in the darkness, his arm draped comfortably across her waist. "I love you, Elle," he murmured, his voice already growing heavy with approaching sleep. "I love you too," she whispered back, listening as his breathing deepened and slowed. Eleanor lay awake much longer, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities both terrible and benign. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of her garden, not as it was now, but as it might be years in the future, the saplings grown tall, the perennials she'd planted having spread and flourished, creating a riot of color and life that continued long after the hands that had planted them were gone. Thursday dawned gray and drizzling, the spring sunshine of earlier in the week replaced by a steady, gentle rain that tapped against the windows and turned the garden vibrant with moisture. Eleanor woke before the alarm, her sleep having been restless and interrupted. David still slumbered beside her, his face relaxed in sleep, untroubled by the concerns that had kept her awake. She slipped quietly from bed, pulled on her robe, and made her way downstairs to start the coffee. The house was silent except for the soft patter of rain and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. These early morning moments had always been precious to Eleanor. A pocket of solitude before the day properly began, time to gather her thoughts and center herself. Today, however, her mind refused to settle, jumping from the practical details of the upcoming biopsy to larger, more existential questions about mortality and time. She stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming her hands, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass, distorting the view of her beloved garden. "You're up early," Melissa's voice came from the doorway, startling Eleanor slightly. "Couldn't sleep," Eleanor admitted, turning to see her daughter, hair tousled from sleep, wearing the faded University of Pennsylvania sweatshirt she'd had since her undergraduate days. "Want some coffee?" "Please," Melissa said, sliding onto a stool at the kitchen island. "I have that site visit in Oakmont this morning. Hoping the rain lets up." Eleanor poured a second mug and placed it before her daughter, along with the carton of milk from the refrigerator. "The forecast said it should clear by mid-morning," she offered, settling across from Melissa. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee, listening to the rain. There was something about these quiet moments with her adult daughter that Eleanor particularly treasured. A different kind of closeness than when Melissa was young, built on mutual respect and shared understanding rather than dependence. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Melissa said finally, "about the sacred being in the ordinary. It's been on my mind." Eleanor smiled, touched that her words had resonated. "It took me years to understand that myself." "I think I'm starting to," Melissa said thoughtfully. "When James and I first got together, everything was exciting and new, big gestures, intense conversations, dramatic moments. But lately I've noticed it's the small things that mean the most. The way he makes my coffee exactly how I like it without asking. How he always calls to say goodnight when he's on overnight shifts. Just being known by someone, I guess. That's it exactly, Eleanor agreed. Being known and choosing each other anyway, imperfections and all. You're pretty wise, Mom, Melissa said with a small smile. Don't let it go to your head. Too late, Eleanor replied, matching her daughter's light tone though her heart felt suddenly full. I've been wise for years. It's about time you noticed. They chatted easily as the kitchen gradually brightened with the morning light filtering through the rain clouds. Eventually, David joined them dressed for work, his presence filling the kitchen with his particular energy. Focused, slightly hurried, but always taking the time to kiss Eleanor's cheek and squeeze Melissa's shoulder in passing. Big presentation today? Eleanor asked, refilling his travel mug with fresh coffee. Budget committee, David confirmed, adding a touch of cream. Not exciting but necessary. Should be home by 6. He glanced at her over the rim of his mug. Will you be home after work? Or do you have library book club today? Eleanor hesitated. She had taken the afternoon off for the biopsy but hadn't mentioned it to either David or Melissa. Actually, I'm taking a personal day, she said, deciding on a partial truth. Catching up on some things around the house. David nodded, accepting this without question. Don't work too hard. The garden will still be there tomorrow if the rain stops you today. After David and Melissa had both departed for work, the house fell silent once more. Eleanor moved through her morning routine mechanically, making the bed, showering, dressing in comfortable clothes, all the while aware of a growing apprehension about the afternoon ahead. The biopsy itself wasn't what concerned her most. Dr. Ramsey had explained the procedure thoroughly, and Eleanor had a high tolerance for discomfort. It was what might follow, the waiting for results, the potential treatments, the conversation she would need to have with her family. Most of all, she feared disruption to the lives of those she loved, the possibility of becoming a burden rather than a support. By noon, the rain had indeed let up, though the sky remained heavily overcast. Eleanor drove to the hospital, the same building where Melissa had been born nearly 29 years earlier. She remembered that day with perfect clarity. The mix of pain and wonder, David's steady presence beside her, the first glimpse of their daughter's scrunched, indignant face. Now she was returning for a very different experience, though one that held its own kind of significance for their family's future. The Breast Imaging Center was located on the 3rd floor, a space designed with obvious care to be soothing. Soft lighting, nature photographs on the walls, comfortable seating in the waiting area. Eleanor checked in at the reception desk, completed the necessary paperwork, and settled in to wait, a novel open on her lap though she found herself reading the same paragraph repeatedly without absorbing the words. Mrs. Hayes. A technician in pale blue scrubs appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. We're ready for you. The procedure itself was clinical and efficient. Dr. Wilson, the radiologist, explained each step before it happened. The local anesthetic that would numb the area, the specialized needle that would extract tissue samples from the suspicious mass, the small marker that would be placed at the site for future reference. Eleanor focused on her breathing, using the meditation techniques she had learned years ago during a difficult period in her teaching career when stress had threatened to overwhelm her. You're doing very well, Dr. Wilson commented as he worked, his voice calm and reassuring. Almost finished now. When it was over, Eleanor was given an ice pack to reduce swelling and detailed instructions for aftercare. Dr. Ramsey should have the results by early next week, the nurse explained as she helped Eleanor into a sitting position. Is there someone who can drive you home? The local anesthetic can make some people feel a bit lightheaded. I drove myself, Eleanor said. But I feel fine. The nurse looked concerned. We really recommend having someone pick you up. Is there anyone you can call? Eleanor hesitated. Melissa was at her site visit, David in his budget meeting. She could call a friend, but that would require explanation. I live less than 15 minutes away, she said finally. And I truly do feel steady. After some discussion, and a thorough assessment of her alertness, the medical team reluctantly agreed to let Eleanor drive herself home, with strict instructions to pull over immediately if she felt at all impaired. The drive passed without incident, though Eleanor found herself gripping the steering wheel more tightly than usual, her mind not on the road, but on the days ahead, the waiting, the possibilities. At home, She changed into comfortable clothes and settled on the sofa with a cup of tea and her novel, determined to distract herself. The house felt unusually quiet, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall marking the slow passage of the afternoon. Outside, the gray day was beginning to darken toward evening, the garden glistening with remaining raindrops. Eleanor must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, the front door was opening, and David's voice called out, "Elle? You home?" She sat up quickly, wincing slightly at the twinge in her left breast where the biopsy had been performed. "In the living room," she called back, adjusting her sweater to ensure the small bandage wasn't visible. David appeared in the doorway, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Taking advantage of your day off to catch up on sleep? Good for you." "Just resting my eyes," Eleanor said with a small smile. "How was the budget meeting?" David loosened his tie as he crossed to sit beside her on the sofa. "Predictably tedious, but we got approval for the community outreach program, which is what matters." He studied her face. "You look a little pale. Feeling okay?" For a moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything: the mammogram, the biopsy, the waiting for results. The weight of the secret felt suddenly heavy between them. But looking at David's face, lined with the day's fatigue, yet softened with concern for her, she couldn't bring herself to add this burden to his shoulders. Not yet. Not until there was something definitive to share. "Just tired," she said instead, reaching for his hand. "I did more around the house than I planned." David squeezed her fingers gently. "You never could take a real day off. It's not in your nature." "Pot kettle," Eleanor teased, grateful for the easy rhythm of their banter. "How many vacations have you spent checking email?" "That's different," David protested with a smile. "I'm constitutionally incapable of relaxation. You, on the other hand, can spend hours just watching your garden grow. One of us has to know how to enjoy the moment," Eleanor countered, settling against his shoulder as he put his arm around her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the familiar weight of David beside her both comforting and suddenly precious to Eleanor in a way that made her throat tighten. 30 years of moments like this. Quiet evenings, shared breaths, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them over decades of partnership. "Melissa called," David said eventually. "She's meeting James for dinner after his shift ends, so it's just us tonight." Eleanor nodded against his shoulder. "I was thinking pasta. Something simple." "Perfect," David agreed, kissing the top of her head before standing. "I'll go change and help you in the kitchen." As David headed upstairs, Eleanor remained on the sofa, gathering her strength. The sight of the biopsy ached dully, a physical reminder of the uncertainty that now colored her days. But she had always been practical, a problem solver. One step at a time, she reminded herself. Just as in the garden, plant the seed. Water, wait, adjust as needed. Dinner was a quiet affair. Just the two of them at the kitchen island, rather than the more formal dining room. David shared stories from his day at the environmental law firm, where he'd been a partner for 15 years. His passion for protecting natural spaces, still evident in the animation that came into his voice when he described a new case involving wetland conservation. Eleanor listened attentively, asking questions in the right places, appreciating his dedication to work that mattered. This had always been one of the foundations of their relationship. Mutual respect for each other's vocations, the understanding that their individual pursuits made them both more fulfilled as people and as partners. "Enough about bureaucratic battles," David said finally, setting down his fork. "How's the book fair planning coming along?" Eleanor smiled, grateful to discuss the familiar territory of her work at Laurelwood Elementary. "The committee's meeting next week to finalize the author visits. We're hoping to get that children's poet Melissa loved when she was in 4th grade. Remember, the one who did those wonderful illustrated verse books about backyard wildlife. Martin Sandoval?" David supplied. "Melissa had us read The Secret Life of Squirrels so many times I still know parts by heart." "That's the one," Eleanor confirmed. "He's semi-retired now, but still does occasional school visits. The children would love him." They cleared the dishes together, moving around the kitchen in the synchronized way of long partnership. As David loaded the dishwasher, Eleanor found herself watching his hands. Strong, capable hands that had held hers through joy and sorrow, that had cradled their newborn daughter, that had built the garden bench where she spent so many peaceful hours. What? David asked, catching her gaze. Nothing, Eleanor said softly. Just thinking how lucky Melissa is to have found someone who looks at her the way you still look at me. David's expression softened. The Hayes charm. Impossible to resist. Later, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor was careful to change in the bathroom, not wanting David to notice the bandage from the biopsy. A small deception, but a necessary one until she had answers. The weight of the secret felt heavier in the darkness, as they lay side by side in the bed they'd shared for most of their adult lives. David's voice came quietly through the darkness. You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you? Eleanor turned toward him, though she could barely make out his features in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Of course, she said, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. Why do you ask? Just a feeling, David admitted. You've seemed preoccupied lately. Contemplative. Just the season, Eleanor offered. Spring always makes me thoughtful. All that renewal and growth. And with Melissa's wedding approaching, milestones make you reflective, that's all. David seemed to accept this, pulling her gently closer. As long as they're good reflections. The best, Eleanor whispered, nestling against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. She would tell him soon, she promised herself. Just not tonight. Tonight, she wanted this simple comfort, untroubled sleep, the luxury of normalcy for a few hours more. The weekend passed in a blur of routine activities. Saturday brought better weather, and Eleanor spent hours in her garden, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the anxiety that hovered at the edges of her consciousness. David worked on a brief in his home office, and Melissa and James came for an impromptu barbecue in the evening, the four of them eating on the patio as twilight deepened around them. On Sunday, Eleanor and David attended the Unitarian church they'd been members of since moving to Laurelwood, though Eleanor found her mind wandering during the sermon about community and interconnection. Afterward, they joined friends for brunch at a local cafe, couples they'd known for decades, whose children had grown up alongside Melissa, whose lives had intertwined with theirs through school committees, neighborhood projects, and shared celebrations. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her calm exterior, participating in conversations, laughing at familiar jokes, offering advice about gardens and books and recipes. But beneath this performance of normalcy, her thoughts repeatedly circled back to the cells multiplying in her breast, the results waiting to be revealed, the conversations that would need to happen. Monday morning arrived with crisp sunshine and a light breeze, perfect spring weather that would normally have lifted Eleanor's spirits. She went through the motions of her workday at the elementary school library, reading to the kindergarten class, helping fourth graders with research projects, meeting with the principal about budget allocations for new titles. It was during her lunch break, as she sat alone in her small office with a sandwich she had no appetite for, that her cell phone rang. Dr. Ramsey's name appeared on the screen. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she answered. Hello. Eleanor, it's Dr. Ramsey, came the familiar voice. I have your biopsy results. Do you have a moment to talk? Yes, Eleanor said simply, setting down her sandwich and straightening in her chair, as if proper posture could somehow prepare her for what was coming. I'm afraid the results confirm a malignancy, Dr. Ramsey said, her voice gentle but direct. The tumor is small, about 1.5 centimeters, but the cells are moderately aggressive. I'd like you to come in as soon as possible to discuss treatment options. Eleanor closed her eyes, absorbing the confirmation of what she had somehow already known. A strange calm settled over her, the clarity that sometimes comes with certainty, even unwelcome certainty. I see, she said steadily. How soon? I have an opening tomorrow at 11, Dr. Ramsey offered. We'll go over the pathology report in detail and discuss next steps. Do you have someone who can come with you? It can be helpful to have another set of ears. I'll bring my husband, Eleanor said, making the decision in that moment. Tonight she would tell David. The time for protecting him from worry was over. Now they would face this together, as they had faced every other challenge in their 3 decades together. Excellent, Dr. Ramsey said. Eleanor, I know this is difficult news, but I want you to know that we caught this early, and there are very effective treatment options. Try not to let your mind run to worst-case scenarios before we've had a chance to talk through everything. I understand, Eleanor replied, her professional librarian voice taking over, calm and collected. I'll see you tomorrow at 11. Thank you for calling personally. After hanging up, Eleanor sat motionless at her desk, the half-eaten sandwich forgotten, the muted sounds of children's voices in the library beyond her office door seeming to come from a great distance. Cancer. The word she had been avoiding even in her thoughts now took solid form, impossible to ignore. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the full weight of fear. Not for herself primarily, but for the ripple effects this diagnosis would have on those she loved. David, who had already lost his father to cancer, and who worried more than he admitted about health concerns. Melissa, in the midst of wedding planning and career advancement, who shouldn't have to shift her focus to her mother's illness. Even Richard, their oldest friend, who had once confessed to Eleanor that he considered her the steadiest presence in his often nomadic life. But self-pity had never been Eleanor's way. Drawing a deep breath, she pulled a notepad toward her and began to make lists, questions for Dr. Ramsey, adjustments to her work schedule that might be necessary, people who would need to be informed. The act of organizing, of creating structure around the shapeless threat, helped steady her racing thoughts. By the time the school day ended, Eleanor had regained her equilibrium. She drove home through the familiar streets of Laurelwood, noticing with particular intensity the spring transformation that was underway. Cherry trees in full bloom, daffodils nodding in gardens, the tender green of new leaves unfurling, life continuing, renewing, persisting. At home, she changed into comfortable clothes and went straight to her garden, needing the solace of soil and growing things before the conversation that lay ahead. She knelt beside her herb bed, weeding carefully around the emerging shoots of basil and thyme, the repetitive motion soothing. I thought I'd find you out here, David's voice came from the garden gate. He was home earlier than usual, still in his work clothes, his expression soft as he watched her. Eleanor looked up, shielding her eyes against the late afternoon sun. You're home early. Court recessed ahead of schedule, he explained, crossing to where she knelt. What are you planting? Not planting today, just weeding, Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels, looking up at her husband. This man who had been her partner through every major event of her adult life. She knew the time for waiting was over. David, I need to talk to you about something important. Something in her tone must have alerted him, for he immediately sat down on the nearby garden bench, his expression growing serious. What is it? Eleanor rose, brushing soil from her knees, and joined him on the bench. Taking his hand in hers, she spoke directly, without preamble. I had a mammogram last month that showed a suspicious area. I had a biopsy done last Thursday. That's what my personal day was really for. Dr. Ramsey called today with the results. It's cancer, David. David's hand tightened around hers, his face draining of color. Cancer, he repeated, the word sounding strange in his voice. But you seem fine. You've been normal. How? It's early, Eleanor assured him, finding herself in the unexpected position of being the comforter rather than the one needing comfort. The tumor is small. Dr. Ramsey wants to see us tomorrow to discuss treatment options. Us? David echoed, seeming slightly dazed. I'd like you to come with me, Eleanor said gently. If you can reschedule your meetings. Of course I can, David said immediately, his professional focus snapping back into place. Of course I'll be there. But why didn't you tell me about the biopsy? Why go through that alone? Eleanor sighed, leaning slightly against his shoulder. I didn't want to worry you until there was something definite to worry about. It seemed kinder somehow. Kinda. David's voice held a note of disbelief. We're partners. Your burdens are mine to share. That's how this works. I know, Eleanor acknowledged. I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. David put his arm around her, pulling her closer. We'll get through this, he said, his voice steadier now. Whatever the treatment entails, whatever we need to do, we'll face it together. Eleanor nodded against his shoulder, feeling both relief at having finally shared her burden, and a deep gratitude for the steadfast love reflected in his words. There's something else, she said after a moment. I don't want to tell Melissa yet. Not until we know more about what we're facing, what the treatment plan will be. David was quiet for a moment, considering. She'll be upset that we kept it from her, he said finally. You know how she feels about being treated like a child. I know, Eleanor agreed. But she's already balancing so much. The wedding planning, the house hunting, her work. I'd rather have concrete information before we add this to her concerns. All right, David conceded. But not too long, Elle. She deserves to know, and she's stronger than you give her credit for. Just until after tomorrow's appointment, Eleanor promised. Once we have a plan, we'll tell her together. They sat in the garden until the evening air grew cool, talking through practicalities and fears alike. David asked questions Eleanor hadn't yet considered, his analytical mind already working to understand the challenge ahead. Eleanor found comfort in his approach. The way he could break down complex problems into manageable pieces had always been one of his strengths, in work and in their personal life. By the time they went inside to prepare a simple dinner, some of the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a tentative sense of purpose. This was not the future they had envisioned, but they would navigate it as they had everything else. Together, one step at a time. The oncologist's office was decorated in soothing earth tones, with abstract nature paintings on the walls and comfortable seating arranged to facilitate conversation, rather than traditional examination. Dr. Laura Chun, a woman in her mid-40s with a direct gaze and an air of quiet competence, reviewed Eleanor's file thoroughly before speaking. The good news, she began, looking at Eleanor and David seated side by side across from her desk, is that we caught this early. The tumor is small, and while the cells show moderate aggressiveness, there's no indication from your imaging that the cancer has spread to the lymph nodes. Eleanor felt David's hand tighten around hers at these words, a small gesture of relief. Based on the type of cancer cells and the tumor characteristics, Dr. Chun continued, I recommend a treatment approach that begins with surgery, a lumpectomy to remove the tumor, and a sentinel lymph node biopsy to confirm the cancer hasn't spread. Following surgery, we'd look at a course of radiation therapy and potentially hormone therapy, depending on the final pathology. Surgery, David repeated, his voice steady though Eleanor could feel the tension in his grip. How soon? I'd like to schedule it within the next 2 weeks, Dr. Chun replied. The sooner we remove the tumor, the better. But this isn't an emergency situation, Mrs. Hayes. We have time to do this properly, with all the necessary preparation. And recovery time? Eleanor asked, thinking of the elementary school library calendar, the book fair preparations, Melissa's upcoming engagement party they were hosting. From the surgery itself, about 2 weeks before you can return to light activities, Dr. Chun explained. The radiation would begin approximately 4 weeks after surgery. Once you've healed sufficiently, that would involve daily treatments, 5 days a week, for about 6 weeks. Eleanor nodded, mentally calculating dates, rearranging the calendar in her head. And the prognosis? She asked, voicing the question that had been foremost in her mind since Dr. Ramsey's call. Dr. Chen's expression was reassuring. With early-stage breast cancer like yours, when treated comprehensively, the 5-year survival rate is over 90%. And with ongoing advances in treatment, those numbers continue to improve. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she reminded herself that statistics were just numbers. Individual outcomes could vary widely. Still, to hear that the odds were substantially in her favor provided a foundation of hope to build upon. The appointment continued with detailed discussions of surgical approaches, potential side effects, and scheduling logistics. Dr. Chun answered all their questions with patience and clarity, never rushing despite the complexity of the information being shared. By the time they left her office, Eleanor and David had a preliminary date for surgery, May 15th, just 12 days away, and a folder full of informational materials to review. In the hospital parking lot, they sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine, absorbing what they had learned. 90%, David said finally, his voice catching slightly. Those are good odds, Elle. Very good, Eleanor agreed, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Now we just need to tell Melissa. They decided to invite her for dinner that evening, rather than waiting for the weekend. This wasn't news that should be delayed, now that they had concrete information to share. David called their daughter from the car while Eleanor drove, careful not to reveal anything that would cause unnecessary worry, before they could talk in person. "Just said we wanted to have dinner with her," David reported after hanging up. She sounded a bit surprised, but didn't ask questions. "She'll be there at 6:30. Eleanor nodded, focusing on the road ahead. "Good. That gives me time to prepare something nice." "Elle, you don't need to cook an elaborate meal tonight," David said gently. "We could order in." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I need the normalcy of cooking. And Melissa will know something's wrong immediately if we have takeout on a weeknight." David didn't argue further, understanding his wife's need for routine activities to ground herself amid the swirling uncertainty of their new reality. At home, Eleanor channeled her energy into preparing one of Melissa's childhood favorites, chicken pot pie with a homemade crust, alongside a salad of spring greens from the garden. The familiar rhythms of cooking, chopping vegetables, sautéing onions, rolling out pastry dough, provided a welcome focus, allowing her to temporarily set aside her anxieties about the conversation ahead. David moved around her in the kitchen, helping where needed, their decades of domestic partnership manifesting in the wordless coordination of their movements. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and a look of understanding would pass between them. Reassurance, solidarity, love deepened by the shared knowledge of the challenge before them. Melissa arrived precisely on time, letting herself in with her key, calling out from the entryway. "Something smells amazing. Please tell me it's your chicken pot pie." "Your nose never fails you," Eleanor called back, sliding the golden-crusted pie from the oven as Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway. "My favorite," Melissa said with a pleased smile, crossing to kiss her mother's cheek. "What's the occasion? Can't a mother just want to cook something special for her daughter?" Eleanor deflected gently, setting the pie on a trivet to cool. Melissa's gaze sharpened slightly, her eyes moving from Eleanor to David and back again. "Normally, yes," she said slowly, "but there's something about the way you both look right now." "Let's sit down to eat first," David suggested, bringing the salad bowl to the table. "Then we can talk." Melissa's expression grew more concerned, but she nodded, moving to help set the table with the effortless familiarity of someone returning to their childhood home. Throughout the meal, she made obvious efforts to maintain light conversation, sharing stories about a difficult client at work and her latest house hunting expedition with James, though her worried glances toward her parents betrayed her awareness that something significant was coming. When they had finished eating, dishes pushed aside but wine glasses still half full, Eleanor took a deep breath and reached for David's hand on the table. "Melissa, we have something important to tell you," she began, her voice calm despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Last week, I had a biopsy done on a suspicious area found during my mammogram. Yesterday, we got the results. I have breast cancer." Melissa's face paled, her hand freezing around her wine glass. "Cancer?" she repeated, the words seeming to stick in her throat. "But you've seemed fine. When did you find out about the mammogram results?" "At my checkup last week," Eleanor admitted. "The day we had lunch afterward." "Last week." Melissa's voice rose slightly. "You've known since then and didn't tell me?" "I wanted to wait until we had definitive results and a treatment plan," Eleanor explained gently. "We just met with the oncologist today." "We?" Melissa's gaze swung to her father. "You knew." "Only since yesterday," David said quickly. "Your mother told me as soon as she got the biopsy results confirmed." Melissa was silent for a long moment, processing this information, her expression moving through a range of emotions: shock, hurt, fear, and finally a determined sort of resolve that reminded Eleanor strongly of David's approach to difficult situations. "Okay," she said finally, straightening in her chair. "Tell me everything. What kind of cancer? What stage? What's the treatment plan? When do we start?" Eleanor felt a surge of pride and love for her daughter's strength, even as she recognized the fear carefully controlled beneath the practical questions. She explained everything they had learned from Dr. Chan: the early stage, the planned surgery, the follow-up treatments, the favorable prognosis. "May 15th, Melissa repeated when Eleanor mentioned the surgery date. "That's so soon." "The sooner the better," David said, the slight tremor in his voice betraying his own continuing adjustment to their new reality. I'll need to take time off work, Melissa said immediately, pulling out her phone as if to make notes. James can adjust his schedule at the hospital to be available too. We should make a care calendar. Sweetheart, Eleanor interrupted gently. Slow down. Yes, I'll need some help during recovery, but this doesn't need to upend your life. The surgery is outpatient. I'll come home the same day. And your father will be here. Mom, Melissa said firmly, setting down her phone to look directly at Eleanor. This is not negotiable. I'm your daughter. I'm going to be here for you, period. The wedding planning can wait. Work can be flexible. You are the priority right now. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since receiving the diagnosis. Thank you, she said simply, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. What about the wedding? David asked cautiously. It's only 5 months away. Melissa waved a dismissive hand. The venue and caterer are booked. The major decisions are made. Everything else can wait. No, Eleanor said firmly. Your wedding plans continue as scheduled. I refuse to let this diagnosis overshadow your special day. The surgery will be done. Radiation will be finished by September. And I will be dancing at your wedding in October exactly as planned. Melissa looked ready to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression must have convinced her this wasn't a battle worth fighting, at least not tonight. Fine, she conceded, but promise me you'll ask for help when you need it. No stoic suffering in silence. I promise, Eleanor agreed, exchanging a quick glance with David, who raised an eyebrow slightly at her. They both knew Eleanor's tendency toward independent handling of difficulties. The conversation continued late into the evening, the three of them talking through practicalities, fears, and next steps. Melissa called James, who insisted on coming over immediately, arriving with a notebook already filled with medical information he had quickly researched between patients at the hospital. By the time Melissa and James finally left around midnight, a preliminary plan had been established. David would take Eleanor to the preoperative appointments and the surgery itself. Melissa would take a week off work to help during the initial recovery period. James would coordinate with David to ensure Eleanor was never alone during the first days after returning home. We're going to get through this, Melissa said fiercely as she hugged her mother goodbye at the door. All of us together. Eleanor held her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I know we will, she whispered, believing it in that moment, surrounded by the love of her family. In the days leading up to the surgery, Eleanor moved through her routines with deliberate attention, finding herself noticing details she often overlooked. The particular quality of morning light through the kitchen windows, the satisfying weight of a favorite mug in her hand, the comforting creak of the third stair from the top. Each ordinary moment seemed suddenly precious, worthy of full presence. She met with her principal to explain the situation and arrange for a substitute librarian during her recovery period. She completed the spring book orders ahead of schedule and left detailed notes about the upcoming author visits. In her garden, she planted summer vegetables and flowers with particular care, knowing they would be blooming and producing while she recovered. The night before the surgery, Eleanor stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit garden below. David approached quietly, standing behind her, his arms encircling her waist. What are you thinking? He asked softly, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. That the peonies will bloom while I'm recovering, she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. And that I'm not afraid. No. David's voice held gentle skepticism. Well, perhaps a little, Eleanor amended. But mostly I feel ready to face whatever comes, to do what needs to be done. David tightened his embrace slightly. You've always been the bravest person I know, Elle. Even when you're terrified, you just keep going. Keep doing what needs to be done. Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the familiar contours of his face. The lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. The slight crease between his brows that appeared when he was concerned as now. We both do, she said softly. It's who we are together. Later, lying beside him in the darkness, listening to his even breathing as he slept, Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge the fear she had been carefully managing. not just of the surgery itself, but of all that might follow. The changes to her body, the discomfort of treatments, the possibility, however remote Dr. Chun had suggested it was, that the cancer might be more widespread than the imaging had indicated. But alongside the fear was a deeper certainty that whatever came, she would meet it with the same strength and grace she had cultivated throughout her life. Her garden had taught her patience, the understanding that growth requires both nurturing and acceptance of forces beyond control. Her family had taught her the power of love, as both vulnerability and strength. Her 52 years had taught her that life was simultaneously precious and ordinary, each day both miraculous and mundane. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she would rest in the comfort of familiar darkness, the solid presence of her husband beside her, the knowledge of her daughter sleeping across town, the garden below her window continuing its quiet, persistent growth. The hospital room was filled with morning light, antiseptic smells, and the quiet bustle of medical efficiency. Eleanor lay propped against stiff pillows, a dull ache in her left breast where the surgeon had removed the tumor and several lymph nodes just hours earlier. The anesthesia had left her mouth dry, and her thoughts slightly fuzzy around the edges, but she was alert enough to focus on Dr. Chen's words as she explained the preliminary results. The surgery went exactly as planned, the oncologist said, her voice reassuringly matter-of-fact. We've removed the tumor with good margins, and the sentinel node biopsy was performed successfully. It will take a few days to get the complete pathology report, but visually, the nodes didn't show obvious signs of cancer spread. Eleanor felt David's hand tighten around hers at this cautiously optimistic news. He had been by her side since dawn, his calm exterior belying the anxiety she knew he felt. Now, some of the tension visibly eased from his shoulders. So what happens next? He asked, his voice steady. Eleanor will be discharged this afternoon. Once we're sure the anesthesia has fully worn off, and she's comfortable with pain management, Dr. Chen explained. You'll need to keep the surgical site clean and dry, and we'll have you back in a week to check healing progress. Once we have the final pathology results, we'll confirm the plan for radiation therapy. Eleanor nodded, mentally filing away these instructions. Despite the lingering effects of anesthesia, her mind was already moving ahead, planning the adjustments that would be necessary in the coming weeks, managing discomfort while attempting to maintain some normalcy, balancing rest with gentle movement, accepting help while not surrendering independence entirely. Any questions for now? Dr. Chen asked, glancing between them. When can I expect to return to regular activities? Eleanor asked. Specifically gardening. Dr. Chen smiled slightly, as if unsurprised by this practical question. Light activities can resume within a week, as you feel comfortable. More strenuous movements, like digging or heavy lifting in your garden, should wait until at least 4 weeks post-surgery, and only with your surgeon's clearance. Your body needs time to heal, Mrs. Hayes. She'll follow instructions, David assured the doctor, giving Eleanor a pointed look that she recognized from countless negotiations throughout their marriage. The expression that said, I know you're already planning to push these boundaries, but please don't. After Dr. Chen departed, a parade of nurses and aides came through with discharge instructions, prescriptions, and final checks. Melissa arrived just as Eleanor was being helped into the wheelchair that hospital policy required for departure, bringing a soft cardigan and slip-on shoes from home. The house is ready, she reported, walking alongside the wheelchair as an orderly pushed Eleanor toward the exit. James set up the guest room downstairs, so you won't have to manage the stairs. I've made soup, and there's a rotation of casseroles coming from your church group starting tomorrow. The guest room isn't necessary, Eleanor protested. I can manage the stairs just fine. Humor us for a few days, David said from her other side. The doctor said to minimize unnecessary exertion. Eleanor sighed but didn't argue further. She understood their need to care for her, to feel useful in the face of a situation largely beyond their control. And in truth, the thought of climbing the staircase to the master bedroom did seem rather daunting at the moment, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. At home, Eleanor was touched to find small comforts had been arranged in the guest room. Her favorite quilt on the bed, a stack of novels on the nightstand, fresh flowers from her own garden in a small vase by the window. Melissa had clearly been busy during the hours of the surgery. "This is lovely," she acknowledged as David helped her settle against the pillows. "Thank you, sweetheart." Melissa smiled, visibly relieved by her mother's acceptance. "I'm going to make some tea. Dad, can you help me with the tray?" Once they had left the room, Eleanor carefully shifted position, wincing slightly at the pull of the surgical site. The pain was manageable, more discomfort than true pain. But the limited mobility was frustrating. She had always been physically capable, taking pride in her self-sufficiency. This enforced dependence, however temporary, would be its own challenge. Through the window beside the bed, she could see a corner of her garden. The tall spires of foxgloves swaying in the spring breeze, the peonies beginning to form buds that would soon burst into extravagant bloom. The sight brought both comfort and a pang of longing. The garden would continue its growth without her tending, a reminder that life persisted even when one stepped temporarily out of its flow. The first few days of recovery passed in a blur of visitors, medications, and brief, shuffling walks around the house to prevent complications. David worked from home, setting up his laptop at the dining room table, where he could hear Eleanor if she called. Melissa came each day after work, bringing dinner, and staying late into the evening. James stopped by when his hospital shifts allowed, his medical knowledge a reassuring presence as he checked Eleanor's healing incision and adjusted her pain management plan. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had grown restless with confinement. The pain had subsided to a dull ache, and she found herself longing for fresh air and wider spaces than the guest room and living room provided. "I need to go outside," she announced on the 7th morning after surgery, as David brought her morning tea. "Just to sit in the garden. I'm not planning to dig up tree stumps." David studied her face, recognizing the determination in her expression. "All right," he agreed after a moment. "The patio chair with extra cushions in the shade for no more than 30 minutes. And I'm bringing you a bell to ring if you need anything." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising her with its normalcy. "A bell? Really, David? I'm not an invalid in a Victorian novel." "Humor me," he said, his expression softening. "I've spent the last week trying not to hover. The bell is my compromise." Settled in the cushioned chair on the patio, wrapped in a light blanket despite the mild temperature, Eleanor felt something tight in her chest ease as she breathed in the garden scents. Rich soil, green growth, the sweet perfume of lily of the valley blooming along the garden path. Here, surrounded by the living evidence of her care and patience over the years, she could believe in her own healing more concretely than in the confines of the house. David brought her tea and the morning newspaper, then retreated to a nearby chair with his laptop, maintaining the fiction that he was working rather than watching over her. Eleanor smiled to herself, recognizing and appreciating his effort to give her space while remaining close enough to assist if needed. "The foxgloves are magnificent this year," she observed after a comfortable silence. David looked up, following her gaze to the tall stems laden with speckled, bell-shaped blooms. "They are," he agreed, "though I've always been partial to the peonies."